Well, I really appreciate the singing this morning. And while I am really glad that you are here with us in our building, and I'm glad for those who are watching us via live stream and maybe later in the day or some other time this week, I do have a bit of apprehension about this lesson. I have struggled with the thought process of this lesson most of this week. So I want to warn you as we begin that I hope you will listen very carefully, and that especially as we come to the end, you will form your own conclusions and your own opinions, as you always should. The subject of the lesson this morning is not a difficult subject. It's just where I'm trying to go with it. And so the subject of the lesson is what Burke's about to put on the screen for you. Good and evil, or good versus evil. And I suspect you are like I in the sense that you have heard this terminology, this phrase, as long as you can remember. We have heard this idea of good and evil, or good versus evil. And I am not a theologian. I'm not even a Bible scholar. In fact, that's why I don't let myself be called a preacher. I just kind of fill in and try to lead us through a passage of Scripture. But there are those who are theologians, and they are scholars, and they understand books like the book of Revelation, and they understand that last half of the book of Daniel, and they understand some of those sayings in Ezekiel. And they say that this subject has been going on even before our time began. It's been going on even before the world was formed or created. And they'll say things like that Satan was a fallen angel, and he had his comrades or his demons, and Satan was evil, and he was opposed to the goodness of God. Now, let's make sure we all understand what evil means. That which is corrupt and immoral. And good is just exactly the opposite. And so when this world was created by God, and when there was that garden of paradise that we talk about so frequently, in the midst of that garden, there was a tree placed there, and it was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the idea is if you take of that fruit, here's the law of the garden, you take of that fruit, your eyes will be opened, and you'll know this good and evil thing. But more than that, the implied thought is you will be experiencing the giant tension in your life between good and evil. And they did eat of that fruit, and they did begin to experience it. And you don't have to turn the pages of the Bible very far until you find out that the world was full of evil. And the immorality and the corruption so great that God said, I can't stand it. And so He sent a flood upon this earth and killed everyone. A flood so great that it would cover the tallest mountain peaks. And even geologists today will routinely confirm that this world of ours, this earth of ours, was covered with water at some point in its history. But one man named Noah tried his best to refrain from the corruption, the immorality, and he tried to embrace the good. Now, he didn't do it perfectly because no man can. But he was trying. And God saw that, and God extended to Noah grace. And God saved Noah and his family. And the world began to rebuild. But it was still there. The good and evil, it was still there. And so we read a few more pages in the book of Genesis, and there are these cities called Sodom and Gomorrah. And they were literally filled with this corruption and this immorality. And God said, I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham would plead with God about good. If there's some good there, don't do it. But they couldn't find any good there. Oh, there was one man named Lot, related to Abraham, and Lot had his problems. But apparently Lot was trying. He was trying to shun this evil thing and embrace the good. And so Lot was able to escape along with some members of his family. And it just keeps happening all over again. You see it in the life of Moses, the tension between good and evil. We saw it in the life of David, the tension between good and evil. We see it in the life of Jesus as we move into the New Testament. Oh, it was all through the prophets too. All the prophets were dealing with good versus evil. Jesus dealt with it. Not too long ago, we went through the book of Acts. Remember how Paul was always dealing with this tension of good and evil? And you and I deal with it every single day of our lives in our own personal lives. I don't suspect there's a day that passes that you and I aren't struggling with the tension between good and evil. Am I close to right about that? Aren't we all dealing with it? And it becomes so much of a burden at times, and we grow weary with it. And I think that's what Paul was talking about when we study way back in Romans chapter 7. And Paul said, in my paraphrase kind of that, he said at the end of chapter 7, I know the good I ought to do, but I don't do it. And I find at the same time when I don't want to do something, I know I shouldn't do something, I end up doing that. He said, I'm a wretched man. Do you know that feeling? Do you know what that feels like? To have that tension in this life? I know what I ought to do or what I ought not to do, and yet I somehow just don't do it right. But the beauty of the New Testament story of Jesus is this, that we are covered by God's grace when we come into His kingdom. And it seems as though as long as we keep fighting against the evil and we keep trying to embrace the good, that the blood of Jesus will keep on cleansing us, because this same Paul that said, this is the wrestling match I have every day of my life, right before he's about to be killed by the Romans, he will say, I have fought a good fight. I have fought a good fight. Now, I don't think he was talking about pulling out his sword and fighting against everybody. I think he's talking about in his life, while Satan was always after me, and while evil was always abounding, I continue to try to do the good. I fought a good fight, which is what God expects of every one of us. And that's why in Romans chapter 12 and verse 9, where we were last week, and we're talking about love, He'll also say this to every one of us who are members of the kingdom of Jesus Christ: you hate that which is evil, and you cling to that which is good. You've got to keep dealing with this good and evil issue in your life. Now, none of that's hard to understand, is it? All that thought process is pretty clear. Now it gets a little more difficult. I have told you over the last several weeks that I am displeased, upset, maybe even a bit frightened about the condition of our world. It just continues to deteriorate with evil. with evil. And the immorality and the corruption of our world seems to increase all the time. And you and I are kingdom people living in this world. And the big question is, yes, I fight this battle in my life every single day, but everything around me is getting worse, and the battle inside is becoming harder. And so I want to show you this graph, this curve. And I know you're going to think that poor Ken has really gone off some way tangent. Burke's going to put it up here. It's just the old-fashioned bell curve. Statisticians use it all the time. And if you look at the tails of that bell curve, it's what I'm calling the extremes. The extremes. And in our society, the extremes are becoming larger and larger. And so that curve is flattening, and the tails are getting larger and larger. And I have to tell you something, that if you live in the extremes, you can influence no one. Even in the subject of religion, whether you're on the far right or you're on the far left, if you live in those extremes, you will not be able to influence anyone. You'll not be able to attract anyone. And you choose any one of our social issues right now. Am I making you nervous? Let me tell you about the hottest social issue going on right now. There was a leak out of the Supreme Court. Unheard of. To have a leak out of the Supreme Court. Without doubt, it was leaked intentionally. And they're saying, by way of the leak, that it may be really soon that the Supreme Court is going to show their vote on changing the federal stance to the subject of abortion. Now that subject's been around for a long time. And so there's a group very vocal that says a woman ought to have the right to choose. Even up until the moment, some say, before that baby is born, a woman ought to have the right to choose to terminate or abort that baby. Because they make themselves believe that life really doesn't begin until the first breath outside of the mother's womb. And there are others who say, no, when that little heart starts beating and those little fingers start wiggling, the baby is alive. And no one has the right to exterminate that baby. And on each side, there are extremes. And so right now, on that one side, there are people who go to a Supreme Court justice's home and they protest. I'm going to tell you, nobody, they don't influence anyone. Nobody is impressed. But long before that, there were people on the way other side who would take picket signs and go out in front of an abortion clinic and protest and say it's not right. And they didn't influence anybody. No one was impressed. I'm going to tell you that the only way the kingdom of Jesus can go forward and that we can exist and be the light of Jesus is that we live in that center and we understand how to live in that center when a world is becoming so evil. It's how Jesus did it. It's how Jesus lived. And so I want you to look at the word Jesus just for a moment. I want you to think about him. Some people say he was radical. In the New Testament, they like to call him radical. They like to paint him over in a picture. Even today, some people like to paint Jesus over in the far right side of that curve. Don't you ever believe it. Don't you ever believe that Jesus was radical. Because Jesus could walk into that which was evil, that which was corrupt, that which was immoral. And he could be kind, and he could be gentle, and he could influence them in such a way that could call them out of that corruption into his kingdom. He could find someone steeped in adultery. He could find someone whose life with poor choices is so messed up. She could have been married multiple times. And he could be so kind and so gentle, not radical, and call them into a different life. Here's the best example I have of Jesus doing that. How many apostles did he have? 12. And everybody remembers that one of those apostles was named Matthew. And probably everybody in this building and probably everyone listening, watching, knows the occupation of Matthew. He was a tax collector, a Jewish tax collector. Now, if you think in that day that the Jews frowned on adultery, if you think the Jews frowned on murder, you watch how they feel about a tax collector. Because a tax collector is an employee of the Roman government. And they are assigned to go out and individually collect the taxes from people. But the employment contract looks something like this. Here's how much you need to collect. Your living will be taken at your discretion, whatever you want, because you are free to collect whatever you want to collect. And so Roman government wants $500 from Richard. I go to Richard and say, Richard, it's 1,000. Tax collectors had a license to steal. And the Jews would look at someone like Matthew, who was a Jewish tax collector, and say, of all people, that he would go to work for the Romans. He was so despised and so hated. And Jesus would come along and say to Matthew, why don't you leave that world and come into my world? But he didn't stop there. And here's the magic thing you need to look at. He didn't stop there. He said, Matthew, let's have a dinner at your house. Let's have a dinner at your house. Invite your friends. Only friends a guy like that has is other tax collectors. I mean, it's a whole house full of tax collectors. And Jesus goes home with him. Now, how do you picture Jesus in that room for that meal? Do you picture Jesus as a radical? Do you picture Jesus standing up and barking out orders and saying, and now I got you here in the room, I'm going to tell you how life ought to be. And if you don't do it right, no, never acted like that. Can't you see Jesus eating with these people and smiling at these people, but never, ever, ever condoning or affirming or accepting the corruption and the immorality, but would invite them out of their world into his. And right now, in our world, it's becoming more and more radical. We must not dare join the radical wings. We must stand where we can influence people, and we must be people of the kingdom. We must be people who can embrace people, but not accept and not affirm, and call them out to a better place. It's called being immersed into the kingdom of Jesus Christ. We have a tendency in this country to praise people who have made such great influence. It could be Martin Luther King. It could be, in another country, a man named Gandhi. They acted in a way that was not extremist. And they invited people from the spirit of love into a new world, a better place. That's the kingdom way. That's the kingdom way. And I've really been struggling with it for a long time now. For months at least, for a year, trying to figure out how in this world of evil that's abounding, so much immorality, so much corruption, how do I embrace it? And so as I read that verse in Romans, hate what is evil and cling to what is good, I thought, how did Jesus really do this? When I know the radicals make no difference, nobody pays attention to them. Never have and they never will. But somewhere you and I have to live with the decency and the love of Jesus, but with the conviction of Jesus, and call people out to live in this world differently. It's not going to be easy. This job of living in this world is going to get harder and harder. And this battle that's going on inside of me is going to get harder and harder. I got to fight the battle inside of me, and then I got to look at how to live in the world today. But it shouldn't be that hard, because Jesus has shown us the way over and over again. He said, this is the way the kingdom works. So we're going to pause and take the Lord's Supper. And yes, we're going to remember Jesus being so intent on what I'm talking about, so intent on destroying evil and bringing forth good, that he would die for it. And he would make it possible for us to be born into a new kingdom. It would be so different from this world, but it would know how to live in this world and smile at people, but invite them into a far better world. I have several illustrations that I don't have time to use. But I've had acquaintances and friends, literally friends, who have had different sexual identity views. But they never, ever one time heard me affirm or condone. But they heard me talk about a different way. I've had coworkers like that. And you're going to run into people in the little town of Cordell, Oklahoma, who are immoral and they're corrupt and they don't know any better. And you don't need to get out on a street corner with a sign and picket against them. You learn how to coexist with them and invite them into the kingdom of Jesus Christ.